Hello and welcome to On the Cube Leadership Podcast, where we're joined as always by the business pastor, Dr. Rod St. Hill, and where we take everyday events from the pop culture, from politics, from the business world, from ministry, as well as from the Bible to learn how we can be better leaders, taking good metaphors from some of the current events. And we hope that you're enjoying our podcast and looking forward to getting into our topics today. But before we do introduce our topic, Dr. Rod, as always, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, as always, Craig, it really is a great privilege and a pleasure to spend this time with you and to share what little wisdom God releases to us with all of those who watch the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. And we aren't experts on these areas, but we are experts at withdrawing metaphors from these events so that we can become better leaders. So, crisis management. That's our topic today, crisis management. As always, I've mentioned this before, we don't always aim to do a theme, but it just seemed like all the topics today all landed under a theme of crisis management. And we'll actually see very different perspectives of different approaches of how to and how not to approach crisis management. As leaders, we are constantly faced with crisis. As a leader, it's actually our responsibility to be able to handle and respond appropriately to crisis. As leaders, people are always looking to us in a time of crisis. And so how we respond, how we manage crisis will actually set us apart as leaders. So I hope that you can learn from some of these examples today. And I want to start out with actually a really, really positive example. Well, it's not a positive story, but their response and the way that they handled this crisis was actually, I believe, very wise from some very young guys. So let's look at pop culture, where we are going to talk about Try Guys. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of the Try Guys. They are famous YouTubers and influencers where they have about 8 million followers or subscribers on YouTube. So very influential, very popular YouTube channel where they produce a lot of fun, comedic content, and where they just very like kind of skit showish kind of, and just talk about a whole bunch of different things. Now, unfortunately, recently, one of the 4 creators, or actually owners of the organization, was found to have had an affair. Actually, I was speaking to someone recently, Dr. Rod, that they said, well, the affair is actually a soft way of saying it. Adultery. Unfortunately, we've tried to soften it. He was caught in adultery with, unfortunately, one of his younger employees. And the way that the other 3 creators or owners of the organization actually responded to it, I believe, is very wise. So to give you a few little facts about it, they found out about the infidelity through a photo that was shared. Now, they didn't release or announce the situation until about 3 or 4 weeks later. So initially they were criticized by the time that they actually took to respond to the situation. But in reality, they were actually seeking wisdom. And they were getting advice from lawyers and HR experts and anyone that they could to try to get advice from the right people on how to approach it right, because they didn't want to rush the situation and they wanted to make the right decision. And so in the end, they got the right advice. They took time. They put a well-scripted and well-structured video together. We'll add the link below if you want to see how they actually responded, which I actually think was very wise because it was very heartfelt. You could tell that their hearts were broken in this situation, but they were taking both smart business decision, but also caring about their employees as well and caring about their followers and their greater community. So, Dr. Rod, what are your thoughts about how they actually approached this situation? Because some people don't usually handle these situations quite well. They get quite gossipy, they get, spread rumors, and it gets quite nasty and vicious and everything. What's your take on how they actually responded to this crisis of one of their key members actually, having an affair or committing adultery?
Well, look, I think one of the most important things was they demonstrated authenticity and integrity because they actually stood up for the values that they purport to believe in.
That's really good.
And that's really, really important during a period of crisis when some calamity happens to an organization. So I think first and foremost, they demonstrated authenticity and integrity, and that stood in their favor. Second, there was no contest about the facts of the situation. That's really important as well. And then I agree with what you said, Craig. There was a delay between their discovery of what had been going on and a public statement. But during that period of time, which was in fact relatively short, it was less than 2 weeks, they sought advice. They sought legal advice, as you said, they sought HR advice. That's really important when you're looking at an outcome leading to the dismissal of somebody from a leadership position. So they had enough wisdom to realize that they couldn't necessarily handle this on their own without getting expert input, which they did.
Yeah.
And once they had gathered that expert input, they then made the decision to go public and explain clearly, one, what had happened, and two, what their response was.
Yeah, that's good.
And really, they didn't leave any room for argument, debate, and they really didn't leave any room for criticism either, except by somebody who might not have agreed with the values upon which their business was built.
Yeah.
But they certainly couldn't be accused of acting in any way that was contrary to their values. And so I think that is one of the great strengths of their response. It was totally consistent with who they say they are.
Yeah, that's good. Making sure we stay consistent with what our core values. But taking that time to seek advice, because too often in these situations, look, unfortunately, we as leaders will come across a time where one of our key members, maybe a key leadership or key in our organization, does do something that's out of line with our values. And maybe it may not be infidelity, but maybe it's something else that's outside of our key values. And sometimes we may, like we've spoken about in previous episodes, look at the performance and just kind of ignore it because of their performance. But obviously that's not the right way. We can respond emotionally and it be more of an emotional thing. But you can tell that these guys, although that they're hurt, they went to the experts. During these times, it's important to go outside of, because number one, it's a HR issue, right? Number one, it is a HR issue, and firing someone, make sure you don't rapidly fire someone without the right HR advice, because you could find yourself in a lot of, hot water, so to speak. But also going to that external advice covers you legally from their business standpoint because they were business partners, HR standpoint because it was an employee, but also it's someone who's externally, not emotionally involved. It's always really powerful to be able to speak to someone else who's not wrapped up in the emotion of the situation and get caught up in responding emotionally, where they can respond a little bit more practically. Now, another thing that they did at great expense, and this is one thing that we as leaders need to be we need to be ready to make the sacrifice, because sometimes making the right decision will cost us money, will cost us a lot of money, and we need to be ready. We need to make the decision that we as leaders are ready to make the hard decisions that will cost us money, cost the organization money, cost us personally money, to make the right decisions. Because they made the decision to remove Ned, who was their partner, remove him from all of their content, remove him from their merchandise. They'd already purchased a whole bunch of merchandise for him, practically just threw away that merchandise, digitally removed him from everything, which would have cost them a lot of time and money to get that done. There was a lot of videos that had already been recorded that were brand deals that they had to scrap. and they lost the money for that. But they, once again, stuck to their values and said sticking to our core values was so much more important than the money that we would have gained. Dr. Rod, making those tough decisions financially can be tough, especially, like, let's be honest, a lot of us will be in that situation to make that decision when it will really cost us. Not just like, oh, okay, we're going to lose a percentage, whatever. No, sometimes it may cause us to lose everything and go backwards. What's your take on being able to make that right decision in that moment that will cost us heavily?
Yeah, look, before you take on a leadership position or before you establish a business, I think you have to determine that you will do the right thing because it is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
That should be your byline. And it may and often will actually cost you financially to do the right thing. You know, there are no guarantees that doing the right thing will boost the bottom line. That's never guaranteed.
No.
It might, and I know academics who have tried very hard to demonstrate statistically that when you do the right thing, it actually boosts the bottom line. But look, there are no guarantees at the outset. I just think that you need to make up your mind before you even get into a situation so that you automatically respond. You do the right thing because it is the right thing to do, not because there may be some gain in the long term. Obviously, you hope to exist long term, you hope to be profitable long term, but nevertheless, you do the right thing simply because it is the right thing to do.
Well, I heard something in a sermon I was actually listening to today about, the benefit, the long-term benefit. You have to look at the eternal benefit of making the right decision, because it will be profitable for us in the long term, eternally, yes, to make the right decision.
You're right.
But
You're right.
But yes, maybe our
Absolutely.
time here on earth, it may not. But I mean, I think I would much prefer that it's, sleeping good at night. That it's touted as it's a cliche statement, but we as leaders need to. I mean, we will be called to account. We will be called to account.
We will.
And so I want to be able to stand in front of Jesus and go, you know what? I stewarded it all. I made as best decisions as I could that were for the kingdom and not just for my back pocket. And so you will be faced with a crisis as a leader. One of your team members may do something that is inexcusable, and you'll have to make the right decision. How do we make that right decision? As Dr. Rod said, we need to predetermine what our decision is going to be. How can we do that? Through understanding what our core values are, then we just make our decisions straight through our core values. We don't necessarily have to try to think of every scenario and how we're going to respond to every scenario. Make sure you know what your core values are, and then just run every decision through those core values. If it doesn't align with them, it's a no. It's that simple. And please seek external advice. Seek the right professional advice for the situation so that you can have wisdom, external wisdom that isn't emotional, but also protects you legally, as well as with wisdom as well. So, talking about responding really well to a crisis, let's kind of flip that on its head and look at an example of someone who, well, didn't quite respond quite well to a crisis. Now, I know not all of our audience are in Australia. We have a bit of an international audience. We are an international podcast. I'm here in the Dominican Republic, and Dr. Rod is in Australia. But still, as an Australian, I'm still quite connected to what's happening in Australia. And if you're an Australian, you would know the OPTUS data breach. You would have heard that OPTUS was hacked and a whole bunch of personal information was stolen. And there was a big uproar about what's going on there, and it's still unfolding as we speak. They're still trying to figure things out, and I'll hand over to Dr. Rod to talk about details. But the CEO, I'm going to look down for her name, Kelly Bayer Rosmarin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She got on and did a presentation as CEO talking about their response to the breach. And it was really interesting, her response. And once again, the link is down below if you want to watch it. It's really interesting. She spent the whole time trying to spin this situation rather than just going straight out and going, this is what's wrong. Like Dr. Rod said, this is what's wrong. This is what our response are. This is the facts. This is what our response is. So Dr. Rod, maybe you can share a little bit more of an insight into that situation and the actual response by the leadership there.
Well, I would have to say I find the whole episode quite interesting because, as many people will know, I'm a director. I'm on a number of boards of charities, and I'm on your board as well, Craig, yep, which is in your private company. So I'm well aware of the kinds of things we face as directors of companies. And I've been fascinated by the whole thing. First, because it wasn't the CEO who fronted the public initially. That was delegated. That's a big mistake.
Was it really? Wow.
Yeah. The first interviews on radio and television were actually by people below that CEO level. They were so-called C-suite officers, but the CEO wasn't the first to address the public.
Before you go on any further, why do you think that was done? Why do you think that leadership decision was made?
Look, I don't know for sure because I have no idea what was going on in the CEO's head at all. But I think all I can say is it was unwise because it became clear very, very quickly that there could have been as many as 10 million customers of Optus whose personal data was compromised. And we're talking here passports, driver's license, the kinds of things that are used commonly for identification purposes.
Yep.
Now, it's actually turned out to be far less than that, and I might explore some of the reasons shortly. It might only be 10,000 people. But so firstly, I think the first mistake was it was clearly a disaster when up to 10 million customers' details could have been compromised. Now, that means the CEO has to be the public face of the organisation. If not the CEO, then the chair of the board. Now, that is complicated as well because Optus is owned by Singtel, a Singaporean company.
Yep.
And I want to address this issue because there are cultural issues as well. So when the CEO did address the public, she, it appears, deliberately misinformed us. So she presented this as a very sophisticated hack when in fact it was something that an amateur probably did. It was probably someone who was quite amateurish who did it. And what it did was it exposed the vulnerabilities of telcos in particular to these data breaches. Now, interestingly enough, Optus and the other telcos in Australia opposed government proposals to impose much higher standards by legislation or by regulation just a year or 18 months previously. So, and they did it because it was going to cost them. So they were looking at minimising their costs. Therefore, they said, no, we don't want to be part of the new regime. And of course, we've seen that enabled them to maintain quite slack protocols, which, as we've seen, ended up leading to what appears to be a data breach by someone who's no more than an amateur.
And
so
that goes back.
The second issue.
That goes back to what we were previously saying is, sometimes the right thing will cost you, and we need to.
Yeah, absolutely,
absolutely.
It could have been done, and maybe this could have been avoided. The next thing, of course, was that Optus treated its customers as if they didn't really matter. So the communication from Optus to customers was lacking, seriously lacking. And it really wasn't until, shock jocks and the government got involved that Optus started providing significant information and fixes to customers. In fact, lots of other telcos and financial institutions and so on started sending text messages and emails to their customers telling them how they could deal with the issues that arose through this breach. I'm not an OPTUS customer, but I got emails from my bank, the two banks that I'm involved with as a director or privately. I got an email from my own telco and from several other organizations, retail organizations and so on, who said, this has happened, this is what we're advising. So that was another misstep. And then finally, and I think this is actually the crux of the whole issue, no one's really picked this up in any of the commentary that I'm aware of, but I think it's highly significant that OPTUS is actually owned by Singtel. Now, if anybody has studied management in any detail, you will know that national cultures matter.
Yeah.
Now, the ownership of OPTUS is with a Singaporean company, that is with an Asian country, and we know that the national culture in Asian countries protects one's face.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, when we were talking about Try Guys, we were saying they did the right thing because they're part of, if you like, Western culture, which prizes transparency. When we're dealing with Asian cultures, though, we know that the idea of saving face is very, very powerful. It's a very powerful value. And I suspect that when we start looking into this, you know, in the cold, hard light of day after all the crisis has passed over, I think one of the things we will discover is that the CEO herself wasn't necessarily free to do all of the things we might expect because of that ownership.
Yeah.
There's a significant cultural difference. And I think this cultural factor has come into play. As I said, that hasn't been mentioned anywhere as far as I know in the media. But I teach management. I teach my students about this every year. And we actually have a look at the empirical evidence of how national cultures affect the way we manage.
Yeah.
So I do, to some extent, have sympathy for the OPTUS organisation because I think to some extent their hands were tied, although I also think there was a lack of wisdom on the part of Singtel not to realise that OPTUS is actually an Australian operation.
Yeah.
And that they really needed to make some concessions, I think, to the different culture. But, you know, whenever we're in business, whenever we're operating across national borders, we must be sensitive to cultures as well. So the whole thing, it was a disaster, which created more disasters because it was disastrously managed.
Yeah, that's really a good point of it created a disaster because it was disastrously managed.
Absolutely.
But I think
I've walked past a few OPTUS retail stores. I can tell you what, there's nobody in them.
Yeah, no.
So this has done enormous damage to the reputation of OPTUS. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, to bring it back to what we as leaders, as everyday leaders can learn from this is one key thing you were talking about is understanding we spoke about knowing what our values are, making sure we know the values of that covering that we're under. You know, in the church world, we're always talking about a spiritual covering, but we need to understand that's relevant in the business world as well. We are sitting under a spiritual covering from the people that are above us, and we just need to make sure what are their values. What are where do those values? Now, I'm not saying obviously we as Christians have a specific set of values that not everyone carries, but there's still some more, let's call them generic values that we still expect, you know, the organization that we're working for or maybe partnered with or whatever. We still need to make sure that our general values are aligned and understand that when it does come to a moment of crisis, well, what pressure are we going to be under to respond in a certain way that is not aligned with our values, and we need to make a decision. Are we going to bow to our bosses or whoever it is that we're under, or are we going to stand up for our values and do things our way? Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to become rebellious, but you may be forced in a boardroom to stand up for a boardroom full of people that are wanting to go one way, and you standing up for your values, as actually Dr. Rod has shared a number of times before. So make sure you, when there's a disaster, take ownership. I think that's it. Like, don't make a spin about it. That's kind of like the main thing that happened with this OPTUS thing is it was just this spin around things, and it was all to save face. So own up to it. Own up to it. Stand up to it, and make your decision. Stand up, own it, and let people know what the response is going to be. Let people know what the move forward is, because that's what people are looking for. People don't care if you make a mistake. They just want to know that you've owned up to it and you have a plan forward. That's, I suppose, what most people are looking for. So, talking about people spinning things, let's talk about politics, because our politicians love to spin things, don't they, Dr. Rod? That's. I
certainly do.
I remember that TV show with Michael J. Fox, Spin City. It wasn't. I must admit, I watched that show as a child, or as a teenager or whatever when it was out, and I never got it until I recently rewatched it. I'm like, I understand what spin means now. Spin City now, because they're politicians. The whole show is just about them trying to spin things. And so we know that the political leaders tend to do that. But when we spin, we tend to blame. And there's a political story I want to talk about where their response to a disaster or to a crisis was blaming. And I don't know whether you guys heard about all the hurricanes that have been happening over here. I say here because I'm in the Dominican Republic. We had a hurricane a few weeks ago pass our island. Praise God, it was meant to cross straight on my city. At the last minute, it diverted and went straight up. Praise God. But then Florida had Hurricane Ian. I was about to say attack it, but not like it attacked it, but it pretty much attacked it. But Hurricane Ian hit Florida, going back now a week or so ago now, and I found it really interesting how the government actually responded to that. Initially, they started to. Well, there's actually this video, and once again, the link is below if you want to watch this video, but. President Joe Biden was standing there at a press conference with Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, and possible future president. I don't know. Well, maybe we'll play in that, but let's not get too political. But Joe Biden was sitting there talking about this hurricane and how it's caused so many more $1 billion disasters at this time than more. He's like, right in the middle where people have no water, no electricity, no homes, everyone's just wanting to know what the government's response are. What does he do? He says, well, it's only proof that it's climate change, right? And you should see Ron DeSantis' face in the background. He just has this such angry look, but you can tell he's being political and he's trying to keep a straight face. But it's like, his people, the people that he's leading, are just looking to their leaders for what do we do now? And what do the leaders do? They blame climate change. Dr. Rod, how do we get to a point where we as leaders, in the face of a crisis, how do we avoid blaming? Because it's a difficult one.
Well, I mean, ultimately, you do want to get to the bottom of any crisis and hold people accountable if, in fact, they are.
Yeah.
And, as a result of any disaster, really, the hurricanes, we call them cyclones here in Australia, flood events, any kind of, but we used to call them acts of God, remember, in the bad old days. If anything bad happened, any natural disaster happened, we used to call that an act of God. And we do tend to want to find someone to blame. And of late, a lot of political leaders have been saying, oh, well, there's been a flood here, there's been a fire here, a hurricane here. That's just proof, isn't it, of climate change. Now, I think that's wrong on a number of fronts. One, laying any kind of blame in the middle of having to deal with a disaster actually helps nobody.
Yeah.
Second, and this is somewhat controversial, but I would stand on this. Science tells us you cannot pin any one disaster to climate change, because climate change is this very, very long-term phenomenon. And you just cannot do that. So they need to be called out because they're being unscientific. And look, I don't even know whether a lot of scientists would fall into this trap. But that's another thing as well. It's just too cute by half to do this.
Yeah. Especially because they based, like him basing the fact that the cyclones are getting worse, he based it on the cost of the cyclone, hurricane.
Yeah.
And it's only because there was a government law that changed where the government was giving flood insurance or whatever to this certain area of Florida, which was all on the beachfront, which was poor area because no insurance company would insure there. So it was only small houses there. But then they lobbied the government, wealthy billionaire developers lobbied the government to put in this government flood insurance. And so the multi-billionaires would be able to build these massive, massive mansions all along this waterfront. And then now that the hurricane comes through, it's caused more damage. Yes, because you built more expensive buildings there. That's why it costs more now. and I just find it really interesting that people are always like blaming this stuff of like, well, climate change. Like, no, if you actually look at weather patterns, you have built on this small bit of land that is right between two different oceans that have two different climates. There is always going to be certain weather patterns when they match, and in that area. I mean, I even ask myself, I don't know. I'm sure there's reasons, and I can't speak for it because I actually live in a hurricane zone now. Like, we literally in hurricane season, and everyone, all our neighbors, everyone that we talk about, it's like, oh yeah, it's hurricane season. Oh, okay, it's just another hurricane's coming. That's what it is. It's like, why would you build something in the middle of of where everything is? So yeah, I think it's funny that we'll grab onto a statistic that actually isn't really relevant and then jump on a bandwagon. And to your point, it's like, it doesn't help anyone. I'm looking here, you're my leader, I'm looking to you for support. How are you going to help me? You're just going to blame it on the weather? Blame it on gas guzzling cars and coal, yeah. So yeah.
But the other thing too, Craig, to keep in mind is there won't be consensus over an issue like, climate change caused this, or we can now put to bed any debate about climate change. You're never going to get unanimity of opinion, but you will get that unanimity, that united community, if you directly deal with the impact of the disaster on people at the time. And look, what they ought to be saying is, look, we will investigate later. Is there something in government policy? Is there something in human behaviour? Is there something that we can't necessarily control, like long-term shifts in climate and so on? But I think you raised a really important point, and that is, why do we allow people to build in areas that we know, based on long historical records, are subject to the effects of natural phenomenon? we're having a similar debate here in Australia right now because there's a lot of rain falling in parts of Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. And there's been quite a debate going on in New South Wales about Western Sydney, where there are houses that have been flooded, I think at least twice so far this year, and they're looking at a third flooding. And one of the issues which has come up is, well, actually, we've allowed huge residential developments where?
In flood
floodplains.
Yeah.
Very similar to the situation that you've alluded to in Florida. So, if we have an open and honest look a little bit down the track, the proximate cause is human folly.
Yes. I mean, look, like we all want to live on the water. We all want to live right. Like, I mean, you look at, I remember the Brisbane floods, right? Going back, almost 10 years now, they would have been almost, maybe, or just over 10 years ago. Yeah, it was 12 years ago.
11.
Like all of the restaurants and everything right on the water were all flooded because the water rise. It's like, well, we built a dam and stopped natural water flow, and we built all of our buildings right on the water. If you look back in history, people would say you were silly for building your community on the water, and people used to change with seasons, right? The weather's bad here. We pack up our tents or their communities or whatever they do, and they just shift their tribe or whatever it was to a different area because they'd used up that land or the resources there, or the weather was going to change. But now, like you say, for folly, we're wanting to build our mansions right on the water. I mean, I used to live in Kingscliff and loved that area, but every time it used to flood, we were cut off. We'd lose electricity, and all the roads in and out would all be flooded. Now, everyone would complain, but I would kind of say it's like, we choose to live here. We know that that's the risk of living here, that's what our community has such an advantage. We sit right on the beach. It's a beautiful place. But when we have crazy weather patterns, things happen. So, how do we, as leaders, how do we find that balance between folly and just advancing? And because we're called to build and create and do new things, like that's great. But how do we find that balance between, I mean, we're talking about floods and obviously building in flood areas, but making that transition into just, let's talk about just normal life. How do we make sure we avoid, chasing folly versus chasing growth and healthy growth?
Okay. Well, look, I think, say in the context of what we've been talking about, I think one has to be committed to look into the interests of others first.
Yeah, that's good.
And I see this incident with President Biden, and of course Kamala Harris came out with all sorts of quite outrageous statements about how the aid was going to be distributed and so on. To me, what's happening there is that the leaders, in this case political leaders, they are just looking for every opportunity to further their own self-interest. I think that's pretty poor conduct in leaders.
Yep.
Leaders should be first looking to those whom they lead.
Yeah.
And I think that counts as much when we're right in the thick of a disaster as it does when we are making plans which are much longer term. So in the case of, say, building in an area that we know is prone to flooding or to hurricanes, we need to take that into account when we're making plans, or if we're a regulatory authority, when we're approving building projects. It is difficult because often it's poorer people They can't necessarily access, say, real estate on higher land because that's more expensive land. And so there are all kinds of issues that we need to take into account. But let's say we do decide, yeah, okay, we will approve large residential developments in areas that we know have been prone to flooding in the past. So then what are we going to do to mitigate the effects of flooding? And that debate is going on as well, but often we don't see very sensible or helpful responses from politicians.
Yep.
So whatever kind of leadership we're in, I do think we need to take a leaf out of Jesus' book, literally. We're here to serve the needs of others, not ourselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, if making a decision is not necessarily in our immediate best interest, too bad.
Yep. Yeah, that's good. So to respond, don't respond to a disaster or crisis by blaming it on other things and running our own agenda and trying to slip our own agenda in there and what will further us. Because the people in the crisis, they are looking to you for leadership. They're looking to you for an answer. And if you're just going to point the finger, that's not an answer. And how can I have faith in you? You're not that solid, foundational person that I'm like, well, okay, I can't rely on you if in a crisis you're just going to point the finger and blame. So talking about serving and putting our own self-interest aside is a great transition to our next, how to respond to a crisis. And actually I want to talk about ministry leaders and talk about their response actually to the same incident, the Hurricane Ian. And it's really interesting that the government were responding with it's climate change, this is a race issue, only certain people and certain classes are actually going to receive the support, everything like everyone like making it their own agenda, everyone blaming other excuses. Or alternatively, and I really, really, really want to like praise the local church and praise ministry leaders, because not always do we have a positive story for the ministry leaders, but it's always great when we can celebrate what the ministry leaders are doing. And in researching Hurricane Ian, I found all these random articles about the government not responding right, everything like that. But an overwhelming number of articles that I actually found was about churches opening up their buildings for people to be able to, as rescue centers for people to be able to sleep, and doing food packages and getting volunteer teams together to go out and help people that were stuck, or go and help people clean up their homes, or it was over my heart, just the joy in my heart just was overwhelming to see all this negative stuff from the government, and yet the church rose. This is how we respond to a disaster. This is how we respond to a crisis, by support. That's all people are looking at as leaders in a crisis. People just want to know that they're supported, and I credit the local church for all of their incredible work. And look, I don't know whether you have churches in that area or whether you know of churches in that area, but please see how you can support them, because they're in the local community doing, but you got to understand their volunteers have lost also. Their volunteers have had their houses flooded or roofs knocked off, and their churches have lost power, and their churches so maybe if you know anyone, or maybe if your heart's moved to maybe support, because that's our response in crisis. We as a church, yes, we're called to our local community, but called to the world as well. And so I just felt that it was really beautiful to be able to see all these articles of churches, of the church. Let's forget churches as in the building, but the church, the people, the ecclesia, all banding together, not worrying about race differences, not worrying about political differences, not worrying about class differences. They were just out helping people and showing their support. Dr. Rod, as a pastor, how would you suggest ministry leaders showing support when I'm well aware that most pastors are struggling to support their own communities? They're struggling to support, keep their lights on and keep their rent paid and everything. Like I know that. How do we as ministry leaders and Christian leaders as a whole, when we've got our own stuff to deal with, how do we keep an eye to support the greater community?
Well, you always ask one or two pretty difficult questions when we get together, Craig. It's pretty hard for small churches, no doubt about it, where you don't have a large staff, and obviously a pastor is going to look to his or her own people initially to make sure they're all okay, and that's the right thing to do because the pastor is the shepherd of his or her flock, which will differ in size depending on the church. But you see, it's what churches can do together that really matters. And one of the things that I'm aware of here in Australia is that our movement, the movement that we're part of, if you like, the denomination, it actually has an organisational setup that coordinates assistance, both financial and in terms of human power, to respond in exactly the way you've described when there are disasters. I am aware that we're not unique. I know of many other denominational groupings where they've actually developed organisational capacity across their denomination. And there's little doubt that it has made a huge difference here in Australia in recent years. We've experienced in Australia a situation where most of the country has been officially declared to be in disaster, part of it because of fire, part of it because of flood. So we've had too little and too much water at the same time in Australia. And the churches have been magnificent in terms of their response. And one of the things which greatly encourages me is they haven't gone looking for accolades. They haven't issued media releases saying, hey, look at us. Look at what we're doing. We're doing this wonderful thing for our community. They've actually just rolled up their sleeves and got involved.
That's good.
And, we are a very small church and we're a very small family. But look, we ourselves have done things like donating a toy collection. That this is a long story, but our older daughter was desiring to have family and she wasn't able to fall pregnant. In faith, we built up a toy collection. She now has 2 children, of course, as some of you will know. But we built up a toy collection. And after the floods a dozen years or so ago in Australia that took lives and just devastated large parts of southeast Queensland, one of the things we could do, a tiny thing, was donate our toy collection, which we did. We were able to start all over again, which we did. Tiny little things like that. People were doing that all through Christendom in Australia. Good. And then in other churches where they had lots of big beefy guys, they got in and did a whole lot of the physical work. They joined what we called in Queensland the mud army after flooding.
Yes.
And they just went in and volunteered to clean out people's houses, and it's just magnificent. And look, it wasn't only the churches, and this is another thing, it was community. Community. And in fact, I think community outdid governments, as you would expect and as ought to be the case. Because this one of the good things that comes out of these disasters is that we realise we are a community, and that we cannot thrive unless we're part of a community,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. And I think also we're coming to the realization that the governments can't fix it all.
Yeah.
And we've really got to take up the challenge ourselves in a lot of these cases. And the churches can mobilize within hours.
Yeah.
It takes longer than that for governments to, because they're just so big.
Yeah.
And I just feel so encouraged. And look, I wouldn't say this has necessarily led to a big pickup in church growth or anything like that, but certainly seeds have been sown.
Yes.
And in any case, getting back to something I said earlier, it's the right thing for a church to do, and you just do it because it's the right thing to do. But the churches have done so much, and to their credit, they haven't sought any kind of recognition. They haven't used it as an opportunity for PR. They've just rolled their sleeves up and got in and helped.
Yeah.
And they've done that through financial means. They've also done that by literally rolling up their sleeves and getting involved. And even things like the toy drive,
Mm-hmm.
which was coordinated through a whole lot of op shops. I think they're called thrift shops in North America, just to give kids a little bit of joy who'd lost everything
Yeah.
in one or other natural disaster. It's such a small thing for us to do, but yet when we do it as the whole body of Christ, it makes a big difference.
That's really good. Actually, one thing that I really take from what you said is it can be very easy for us to criticize the organization that we're a part of. It can be very easy, especially within the church, to want to defect, so to speak, and go off and do our own thing and maybe go and start our own thing. And while, yes, we may be able to run completely how we feel that God has called us to, that does pull us away from the power in size. Like there is a lot of influence and power in a larger organization. There's benefit to that. There's shared resources. There's like you said, you're part of a larger organization or a denomination that in a space of a crisis, if you're just a church on your own, you wouldn't be able to be a part of it. But there is a crisis, and you're part of something that is already doing something, so you can go and be a part of that rather than trying to start something else yourself. I think it can be very tempting as leaders to go, well, I'm just going to do it my own way and do it by myself. Just remember, there is power in being part of something bigger. Now, that doesn't mean that everything they do is right or anything like that, but there are some advantages at times. So with the church getting so much negative criticism, especially lately with a whole bunch of other things that have been in the news, I just think it's really beautiful to celebrate that this is what the church is for. This is what we're being called to, is to support. And the right way to respond in crisis is support. Support those people. That's all they're looking for. They're looking for support. And sometimes that support just comes in an ear. Sometimes that support comes in a shoulder to cry on. Sometimes that support just is them knowing that you care. People just want to know that they're supported. So let me encourage you as leaders that when you're facing a crisis, let's make sure that we show support to those that are in crisis. But let's transition to the ultimate example of how to respond to a crisis. As Dr. Rod mentioned earlier, let's take a leaf out of Jesus' book. Literally one of the books. Let's look at the leadership lessons from Luke. And I felt that it was kind of appropriate, considering we've been talking about storms, to why not share from Luke 8, where in verse 22 to 25, where Jesus calms the storm. That's right. You know the storm. They push out on the sea, and Jesus is asleep in the bow and a storm comes up and the waves are crashing over it and they wake Jesus up. The disciples wake Jesus up and go, "Don't you care that we're drowning?" And what was the disciples' response was fear. The disciples' response was they were actually blaming Jesus, like, "Don't you care about us? Like, this is you." And what was Jesus' response? All what he did was he got up and he created calm. In the face of a storm, in the face of crisis, it is so important that we as leaders can create calm, because we all know that in the face of crisis, things are chaotic. That's why they call it a crisis. It is chaotic. There's chaos everywhere. People are looking for that stability, looking for that calm. And unfortunately, I've seen way too many leaders respond to crisis with stress, respond with anxiety, respond by venting their stress and them getting frustrated and them throwing things or whatever, throwing their own tantrums. But if we don't show calm as a leader, they don't know who to rely on. They don't know who to look to. I must admit that the one gift that I've had, and I don't know whether it's a natural gift or a nurtured gift, is I've always been good in a crisis. Now, I don't know whether it's nurtured because growing up, my father owned a security company. So I was always, from a very, very young age, I used to go out on patrols with my father at big events. I'd walk around with semi-uniform, not quite legal, but a uniform that was similar to him. I was a little kid walking around, and I just saw my father deal with crisis or urgent situations, and so I've always found myself good at responding to a crisis. However, there are times when I don't, and those times are when I'm stressed. Those times are when I'm tired. Those are times when I'm probably not at my best, so I'm not at my best to respond to a crisis. And so one key that I'd probably share from my experience is we need to be able to bring peace and calm like Jesus did to that storm. We need to be able to bring peace and calm to a situation, not stress, anxiety. We can't add to a crisis. We need to remove the storm from the crisis. And so we need to make sure that we're well rested, that we can manage our stress levels, that we're ready, that we have that, I suppose, margin in our energy and emotion to be able to respond to a crisis. Dr. Rod, what would you say is your natural response to a crisis?
Oh, like everybody, if you're not careful, fear rises up.
Yes.
But I'll tell you what, one of the things, in a sense, it's a burden that you bear as a leader.
Yes.
Is you got to deal with fear very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm not sure why it was or how Jesus was able to sleep in that boat, because I'm guessing the sea began to get rough and so on, and that was one of the signs that there was an impending disaster. And as you rightly point out, the disciples they were fearful for their very lives, and they were probably a little bit offended that Jesus was still asleep in the stern of the boat on a pillow.
So maybe sleeping through a crisis is not the best response.
No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't sleep through the crisis. But so most people react with fear, and look, as leaders, that'll happen to us as well. Yeah. So we have to learn how to actually live with that. We've got to put that down, and as you say, we have to create a situation of calmness. In other words, we really do have to calm the storm. Now, as a Christian leader, don't think you can't literally speak into the situation. What did Jesus do? He actually spoke to the wind and to the waves.
Yep.
And the Bible tells us they obeyed.
Yep.
And that caused other problems for the disciples as well. because they still didn't know Jesus well enough, and that caused them a few problems. But speak into a situation. I do that.
Yeah.
Speak into that crisis. Pray into that crisis. Intercede.
Yeah, it's good.
Because it will make a difference, because God hears and things happen in the spiritual realm. We're not always aware of exactly what happens, but things will happen. So as a leader, never, ever, ever give in to fear, but understand that we do have enormous power in our prayer. I've actually just finished preaching 2 Sundays in a row on a subject which was only, I guess, indirectly related, but my topic was actually praying against the great awakening. So there's quite a crisis, a very significant clash of Christian culture or Christian worldview against what is becoming the prevailing worldview in the West, which loosely is referred to as woke or wokeism. And it's a significant crisis because it's leading to danger for Christians and for Christian organizations. And our common reaction, yes, is fear, but also anger. But what I've been teaching in my own church is actually we need to, as it were, suppress that anger, that fear reaction, because now is the time to pray. In fact, it's time to intercede. And there are some biblical principles that we can apply. And look, as a leader, we will only react rightly or correctly if we practice it.
Yeah.
And now, if we've been a leader for a long time, we would have experienced storms.
Yep.
And we will have experience in how to deal with them. But otherwise, I think we've actually got to rehearse these situations.
Yep.
So that just as you practice a physical skill, you got to practice this other prayer skill, the emotional skill, and so on and so forth of actually leading your people through a storm, through a crisis. So I think this little story.
So in that with practicing, when you said that, my mind went to fire drills at school.
Yeah.
I remember we used to have fire drills at school. What do you think about like literally doing crisis drills with your team?
Oh, it's not a bad idea at all. Well, certainly here in Australia, you are obliged to run fire drills on a regular basis. So you've got to do that, right?
Yeah.
But I think you can transfer that idea into crisis management, say on a board of directors or within the senior executive management of an organization as well. Because, see, the key was Jesus knew what to do.
Yep.
That was why he didn't share the same fear as the disciples. Because he asks them, doesn't he, in the way in which this incident is reported in Luke, I think it's true in Luke, he actually says to them, where's your faith?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, see, it wasn't a problem for him because he knew where his faith was. And I think as leaders, we need to know the same. So that as it were, that natural fear that rises when we're facing any kind of storm, a literal storm or a metaphorical storm, so that actually is either suppressed or overcome by our faith.
Yeah.
And our faith can in part be encapsulated in our processes or in our training, in our practice, because that can actually be something that becomes a solid foundation for our faith. But yeah, never discount the power in prayer. And we can be like Jesus. We can actually speak into a situation. I can give you a specific example.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I was involved in the establishment of a Christian radio station. Our studio was on the first floor level of an older building in the CBD of the city where we lived. There was a shop below. It caught fire. And the leaders, our station manager and some of us who were on the board at the time, we actually said, we spoke to that fire and said, you cannot come up to our floor. It didn't.
Wow.
We got some smoke damage because we didn't pray about the smoke. We got some smoke damage.
You spoke to the wind, but not the waves. You spoke to the fire, but not the smoke.
Absolutely. Another time, my younger daughter and her husband, they lived in a little place called Laidley North to be exact, and it was threatened by floodwaters. And they were evacuated. My daughter actually got marooned up in Toowoomba where she was working. My son-in-law was evacuated from the house. And at the time that he was evacuated, the floodwaters were nearly at their front door. And I can remember my wife and I, we just prayed and we said, we command you to stop. You're not going to enter the house. And the floodwaters stopped at the front door.
Wow.
So, I think we can pray into a literal storm because we've got authority as believers, but we can also pray directly into any kind of a metaphorical storm as well. That doesn't relieve us of the need for some action. We've still got to have the wisdom to act, as it were, in the physical realm. But our real authority and power comes in the spiritual realm, which we don't observe most of the time, but we need to have confidence in the efficacy of prayer.
That's really a great note to finish on. As leaders, we do have to understand the power of prayer and how to use it in the face of a crisis, because we need to cast our eyes on Jesus in a crisis. We can't be looking at the situation. We have to look through the situation to Jesus as to his support that he is going to give us. Then we can stand up as leaders and speak from a place of confidence because we have faith that Jesus does listen, that he does hear what we request, and he will protect and provide for us. So as long as we understand and have that faith, we're no longer succumbing to the fear that everyone else is. We can stand up and speak calmly and take command over that situation, the literal or metaphorical storm or crisis. So as leaders, how do we handle crisis? Well, we can, as we looked at pop culture, we can handle it properly with wisdom, advice, and maturity. Or we can try to spin it to make another story out of it. We could blame others, like climate change, like Joe Biden did. Or we can respond by supporting our fellow humans and speaking calmly, bringing calm and command to the situation. Because in a crisis, we as leaders, people are looking to us. People are looking towards you in a face of a crisis, like, how are you responding? They're looking at, like, how are you reacting? What's your perspective? What they are looking to you to guide them. And so we need to stand strong with confidence, but with peace, the peace that surpasses all understanding, as is written, that we have faith in God, that he is in control. And that is what will set us apart as leaders, as the difference between someone who leads the worldly way, that is just leading for themselves, versus a Christian leader who's leading for the kingdom and looking for, as we spoke about earlier on, the eternal reward that we are going to get from our good Lord and Savior. So, Dr. Rod, thank you as always for joining us and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you for allowing me to, Craig.
My pleasure. And thank you for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time to watch our podcast. We hope that you saw value, that you are now feeling more confident as a leader in how to respond to crisis. And I hope that this has added some value to you to help you rise up as a better leader. If you like this, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any thoughts on any of our conversations today, or want to share your experiences with dealing with crisis, put them down below in the comments. We'd love to be able to hear from you. And hey, if you want to hear more from Dr. Rod and myself of faith-based leadership development content, feel free to subscribe. We would be absolutely honored to have you along this journey with us. So we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. And once again, thank you, Dr. Rod.